Hello, everyone, and welcome to another talk. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Dylan Warren Davis, a very well-known palmist, or actually, should I use the word palmist? It's probably, how do you best like to describe what you do?
I prefer a more neutral term, hand reader.
Hand reader.
I find
Okay.
palmist has negative emotive connotations, detracts from what the subject's all about. If you look up what palmistry means, it literally means the obscure origins of a hand, which I don't think at all does justice to the whole art of being able to read a hand. So I've used other names like Cheiromancy and chirology, but I find hand reading is just simply most direct, most inoffensive.
It kind of says it all, doesn't it? It's sort of,
Yeah,
you don't really need to go beyond that. I should just mention the reason we're speaking today. Obviously, I don't really class myself as a hand reader per se. I have an interest in, well, a large interest in Vedic astrology, and because of that, I got interested in what they call Hasta Rekha. So Hasta is the hand, Rekha is the lines. So it's a branch of the Vedic system of analysis. So hand reading is a big part of astrology per se in India. And having got interested in that, I just was looking back towards the Western tradition. And, I mean, it's not something I really know that much about. So obviously, this is one reason for speaking to you today, to try and get a better insight into, perhaps for my own benefit, how the two systems kind of, how they cross over. What are the similarities and what are the differences? So just listening to you will give me a much better understanding about what's happening in the Western tradition. And on top of that, obviously, you're a practicing herbalist as well. So that's another point of interest, how you're being able to combine the herbs with your hand reading, or how that works as a package. So I think I think at this point I'll hand it over to you, and if you could just sort of maybe give us a little bit of your background, how you became interested in this, where you started, and how you've developed it into the technique you're using today. So over to you, Dylan.
thank you, Andrew. It's a long story, but to kind of abridge it as much as possible, basically my time at school was utterly horrendous. It was very, very stressful, with the exam pressures building up, and I suppose parental expectations of what I was going to achieve academically, all combined to be too much. In hindsight, I now recognize that I was dyslexic, I was dyscalculic, I was dysgraphic, and to boot, I was also dyspraxic. So I was a very neurotic, insecure, clumsy, gauche sort of teenager. And I was not at all happy in that space at all. And then through a whole quirk of events that I needn't go into now, I met someone who did yoga. And as my sort of academic stress came to a head, I failed to kind of get my act together to complete an assignment. And instead, I went to visit my friend and said, I want you to teach me how to do yoga. And this guy called Terry said, well, I can't sort of initiate you into meditation because you have to have a spiritual teacher to do that. But what I can do is teach you the rudiments of pranayama exercises, the breathing exercises, alternate nostril breathing and so forth. And I thought, oh yeah, great, that sounds good. And I went home and immediately put them into practice. And then the following day, I came back from school in the usual stressed out state. And I sat down and did the pranayama. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I experienced peace. And it wasn't just sort of a moment of relaxation. it was a profound piece. And it was absolutely like chalk and cheese. I came home completely wired with sort of anxiety and stress. 20 minutes of pranayama, 10 minutes of kind of like quiet contemplation afterwards. I was serene as anything. And that was it. That was the moment I really became sort of hooked on sort of yoga. I then progressed and I found I could accommodate all the stresses of the day with increasing ease. At least then I knew I could go home and ultimately do some pranayama and get rid of my stresses. So it got a lot better. But as I sort of carried on discussions with my friend Terry, I saw this little picture on the wall, and it was of his teacher. And I looked at his face, and he was like a sadhu with sort of robes wrapped around his head and wrapped around his body. I said to Terry, "Who is this man?" And it's, "Oh, that's my spiritual teacher, Swami Narayanananda." And I kind of looked back at him and thought, wow, this guy knows everything about me. And it was a sort of gobsmacking realization. And I thought, oh, that's a bit scary. And then suddenly I felt an assurance in it. I thought, thank God someone knows what the hell is going on inside me. At that point, I realized I too would have to go and meet this man. And so there I was, what, 17, and I was sort of basically earning money on the farm, collecting eggs, and I saved up the money I needed to go to visit him. And every summer, Swami Narayanananda came to a place in Denmark, a little village called Gilling. And so I got the Harwich ferry across to Esbjerg and took a train across up to Horsens, and from there got a bus to Gilling. And there I was in his presence that evening I arrived, and I was completely overawed. And he was like holding darshan, he was sitting on a little dais above all the sort of disciples who gathered around him. And I was just looking around, and then suddenly was this, like in the spotlight of the searchlight sort of coming down at me. And he just looked straight through me. It was just an awesome moment. And after that, the head monk came up to me and said, "Swamiji has just said that you must meditate on nothing. When you succeed, you'll be ready to be initiated." And this monk had said it can take 2 or 3 months to be able to do that. So I thought, oh God, I'm only here for a month. I'll just be able to do it inside a month. And anyway, the next couple of days, my meditations were a little bit all over the place. And suddenly in the evening, boom, I let go and I was able to meditate on nothing. And I found that sea of tranquility that I experienced first when I was doing my pranayama exercises. And at that point, the following day, I received instructions that Swamiji would initiate me into having a mantra and teach me the sort of deeper aspects of meditation. So that all progressed very wonderfully. And my time of the month sort of was up. I had to return to Britain. And I thought, wow, I just want to sort of become a monk and sort of do more yoga. And Swamiji, you must not become a monk. You must go back to school. Your path is in the world. And I thought, oh, bloody hell, is it? I mean, the prospect of going back to school was utterly horrendous.
Mm.
But the term started, and I had biology as one of my first lessons. And my pet hate was just looking down a microscope and drawing what I saw. And I looked down the microscope at some, I don't know, plant tissue or something. And I suddenly saw it in a completely different light. Had this kind of aesthetic sense of the beauty of the cellular structures and everything. And at that point, my whole stresses about learning at school completely relaxed.
Mm.
See a different perspective to education than getting exams, taking in information, learning it, regurgitating it for the exam. So I kind of changed my whole attitude to learning. And once I did that, I found I could study so much more easily. I could pursue what I was interested in and discover more about things, see how things connected together. And that made a big, big difference. So ultimately, when I emerged from school, my exam results were not brilliant. Because basically I've had so many years of being useless at school. But I had this sort of metaphysical awareness from the yoga. And I was looking around for what to do in my life, something that would marry the scientific. I did have a sort of scientific training while I was at school, to marry the scientific with the metaphysical. And I suddenly realized that herbal medicine would be ideal. My mother was a medical herbalist, and so all my sort of formative years, adolescence and teenage years, I literally grew up with herbs all around me, growing here, there, everywhere. I used to plant herbs for my mother. I used to gather them. I used to harvest them and make tinctures from them. So I'd osmotically absorbed many, many years worth of herbal experience without even considering whether I wanted to be a medical herbalist. I was uniquely placed to become a medical herbalist. Obviously, then I commenced my studies. Now, at the very first seminar, I had an amazing synchronistic event. There was probably 30 or 40 of us all in this hotel room, laid out with this tutor at the front and rows of tables receding back from the front. And I thought, well, I'm going to really study herbal medicine. I want to be in the front row. So I aim for the front row seat, bang in the middle, right in front of the tutor. And I walked down one aisle, and out the corner of my eye, I spotted someone else also walking down a parallel aisle. And we both came to the same table. We drew out the chairs simultaneously. We sat down in complete unison, and we turned to confront each other, and we both said, "Hi," simultaneously. And as we did it, we think, what the hell happened there? How did we do that? The timing was just perfection. We became phenomenal friends. But that evening, when our friendship was relatively young, a whole contingent of us herbal students all went down to an Indian restaurant. And so we had this huge circular table, the service was unbearably slow. We were all starving. And this girl, Barbara, grabbed hold of my hand and I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I just wanted to have a look at your hand." I said, "Okay." And she then started describing um, situations from my childhood, from my adolescent years. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. How do you do all this? And she just started explaining more about how your life is reflected in the hand.
Mm.
And I thought, wow, this is incredible. And as I then separated from that seminar, I kept coming back thinking about hand reading. As I was confronted with my course material, it was massively scientific with all the shortcomings and drawbacks of a scientific perspective.
Mm.
Science sort of analyzes things, chops things up, reduces them to underlying molecular structures and so forth. And in that perspective, you lose all awareness, understanding of the whole person. So I, fairly early on in my herbal training, recognized the need for a holistic diagnostic system. And what Barbara had done for me, I suddenly thought, I'd like to study hand reading. It makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
And my yoga teacher, Swami Narayanananda, said in one of his darshan in passing that when people do their sadhana, their spiritual practices, sort of intently with purpose, then as improvements in their consciousness happen, then the lines on the hand will change.
Mm.
And I thought, wow, this is incredible. So then once I'd made that sort of adjustment, that's what I wanted to do. Suddenly my mother, who was practicing in London, needed a dispenser. And she said, "Well, would you like to be my dispenser at my practice in London?" And I said, yes. And I said, "I don't know whether I want to do it full time." And I thought of Barbara. Would she want to do it? And she immediately said yes. And so we both worked for my mother. We both saw all the medicines that my mother made up. And then we actually did studying together.
Mm.
So we compared notes, we did sort of clinical practice on each other, and sort of got to know each other very, very well in that respect. And then as we got onto the topic of hand reading, Barbara gave me this essay written by another guy called Terry. And this was an essay entitled The Basis of Intuitive Diagnosis. And I read it and I thought, wow, this is incredible. This is precisely what I am looking for. And at the time, I was very much aware that Terry was a Buddhist teacher, Chinese Buddhist teacher.
Mm.
And as I've explained, I was very kind of committed to doing an Indian form of Vedic yoga, basically.
Mm.
So I thought, oh, I might be mixing my drinks here, and it might not be such a good thing. I consulted the I Ching about it, a book that I came to have enormous respect for. And it gave the unexpected as like the highlighted hexagram. And I was a bit mystified. Why should it be unexpected? Anyway, Barbara said, there's a whole group of us having a party just down the road from you. Do you want to come along? And I said, okay. So I went along, and it turned out that who should be there but her teacher, Terry. And there he was, speaking away. He had a collection of people around him, and he was having profound arguments, discussions, quite a few sort of hot-headed characters around him, trying to disprove him, but he was mostly refuting him. But I didn't kind of enter into this sort of circle. I was very peripheral to it. And come the end of the evening, thought, well, it's time to go. I decided to sort of leave. I hadn't formally been introduced to him, so I thought, well, I don't need to say bye-bye. And as I turned my back on him and to exit the room, he said, "Hey, Dylan, you don't do any of my yoga classes, do you?" I said, "No." I was astonished that he knew my name, and said, "Well, come along. One starts next week. Be there." I thought, gosh, I've done it now. So I turned up at this yoga class, and my experience of Chinese yoga was much, much more dynamic than the sort of hatha yoga that I'd previously practiced. And then after a couple of years, well, I should say prior to that, after this first meeting of him, we all went down to the local Greasy Spoon after the class for
Like you
tea
do.
and whatnot. And Terry sat at the table opposite me, and it was a great big long table with a dozen or so of us around. And he then spoke to me directly and said, "Well, what got you interested in it?" I said, "Well, as it happens, Barbara gave me your essay on the basis of intuitive diagnosis. And it was extraordinary. It's like we had this tunnel of conversation happening in the general cacophony of this big cafe. And it was incredibly serene and intense. And he then said, "If you study with me for a couple of years, then you and quite a few other people around this table will understand the principle of intuitive diagnosis." And then suddenly, boom, that conversation was lost. It was like the signal disappeared, and it was like it never ever happened. So as it happened, it came true. Sure enough, 2 years virtually to the date, Terry then said to me after a yoga class, "Hey, Dylan, you don't do the hand reading, do you?" I said, "No. Be at my class. It starts next week. You'll really love it." And it was incredible. The first class made such a lot of sense to me. It just clicked. Within 3 months, I was practicing it. I was teaching it. And ultimately, it grew to the point where, as a sort of impecunious student, I suddenly got an income from reading hands, and I paid for the whole latter 2 years of my herbal training purely from what I earned through reading hands and teaching it. So that's how I got into it.
Right.
Once I got into it, it sort of took on a whole dynamism of itself. And
Can I just ask, with regard to your friend Barbara that was doing it, so was she already using it with herbalism herself, or was it just two separate practices? So she was interested in the hand, she was interested in herbs, but never the twain met, or did she already have some understanding of how the hand could be applied medically?
That's a good question. I think she just had a sort of passing interest in hand reading. I soon eclipsed her with my kind of intensity of study. And by the time my kind of hand reading work just took off. She'd sort of largely given up on it. I saw her
So
do
she was
a
kind of
couple.
just the conduit, really, that just funneled you in the right direction.
That's right. So in that respect, I'm deeply indebted to her. No, that spontaneous moment of her grabbing my hand and immediately just giving me impromptu reading was an amazing sort of catalytic moment that ultimately created a whole pathway in my life.
So were you also thinking at that point, after you had some understanding, or you'd had a good basis in hand reading and you were already interested in herbs, were you beginning to connect the two? You thinking, okay, maybe I could combine these two, maybe I could look at hands and try and get some kind of constitutional analysis as well? Or were you still thinking of it as just like a separate discipline? So you'd either do somebody's hand or herbal treatment, or were you already seeing a path where they could join together?
I think what actually happened for me was the success of the hand reading was wonderful. It was more than just looking at illness in the hand. The bulk of the work that I did for hand reading was relationship issues, or what work should they be doing in their life, or they'd reach a certain sort of crisis moment, break up, or of their relationship, or they've suddenly lost their job, and they don't know what direction to kind of proceed in. So I found the readings were very illuminating for people at those sort of crises moments in their life. And it was a bigger perspective than the medical work. At the time, as I was doing my herbal training, the more kind of the scientific framework was employed, the more removed from people I became. And I felt this sort of estrangement between the two disciplines. I suppose in the early days, when I saw patients, if there was like a sort of neurological component, let's say, to their illness, I would then suggest a hand reading. And then out of the hand reading, I could marry a lot of the information with a lot of the medical ideas that I was communicating to them. So in that sort of melting pot between the two polarities, my understanding kind of grew. But I think where it started to really make sense for me was when I studied astrology. Astrology is such a key component to the culture of metaphysical culture of the West. When I started studying Nicholas Culpeper, suddenly I'd reached at that point the specialist area of horary, which is the astrological judgment based upon moments when key issues come into your mind.
Yeah.
Like, should I change jobs, or should I invest such and such, or where is my cat gone? I remember was one topic that came up. And it was so freeing from the general sort of psychobabble astrology that I'd previously studied. And then out of that, a specialist form of horary was decumbiture, which is the astrology of when people take to their beds. They evince their illness. Oh, God, I've had enough. I've got to go and lie down now. That moment is like the birth moment of the illness, the dis-ease.
Oh, I'm with you. Yeah.
And I attended a seminar that showed one true chart that Culpeper has bequeathed to us, where he marries the events of an illness with the selection of herbs. And for me, it was another sort of eureka moment.
Mm.
I could suddenly see this was all Western herbal philosophy in a nutshell, which had been very selectively denied to us as a result of a scientific training of modern herbalism. I then went home and looked at my mother's copy of Nicholas Culpeper, um, and I suddenly could see it in whole new eyes about, dandelion ruled by Jupiter and so forth. And I could intuitively understand where this guy was coming from. So once I then extensively studied Culpeper, I just literally read everything I could about him and really got into decumbiture. Then that provided the framework with which I could apply things from the hand, from the chart, into the medical context. And after a while, you can do away with the astrology and the hand reading. You just learn how to read situations.
Mm.
As soon as a person comes into your consulting room, you intuitively know what is wrong with them, and you can understand, immediately visualize the appropriate herbs
Mm.
that they need to put them right.
I had a good friend of mine who was he was a practicing astrologer. He's very good, and he always used to say to me, he saw the chart once he constructed the chart. It was for him, it was more like a kind of a scrying glass. It was just something that he would look into and see patterns. It's almost like he was forgetting. He wasn't really that bothered about the astrological significance. He said something in the patterning told him where things were, And I mean, to a certain extent, I've seen that a little bit. I work with the Indian astrology, so they use this kind of, you have a North Indian and a South Indian chart. So the North Indian chart is, it would draw, it's basically a square with the X on it, and then you draw a diamond inside, so you end up with 12 boxes. And to me, that I always sort of see that as a mandala. So, without even knowing what anything is, just seeing where things are in that shape, and what areas represent what, you begin to get a sense of what's going on. And I suspect that's probably what you're going to say a little bit about the palm, is that you're kind of, you're looking down at the hand, and almost these patterns are sort of like lifting out of the kind of the like you say, the background noise, and you're seeing these sort of clarities that are coming out by certain signs.
That's right, yes. I mean, I can concord with what you're describing with the astrology there. When I first studied astrology, it was longhand. You worked out all the calculations, positions of the stars from the ephemeris.
Wow.
And then you drew a chart, and you then placed the planets in position. Now, of course, with computers, it's all done in a
Instantaneous,
snap,
yeah.
and virtually every calculation of central dignity and every fixed star is all done there and then. But it kind of, you miss out on what I describe as the ritual of drawing up the chart. When you posit every planet one by one in the house and the sign, you're already computing and visualizing and things. And when you've got two planets in aspect, you're weighing up the sort of how those two energies work together or don't work together, as the case may be.
Mm.
So, yeah, once you kind of get into it, then that knowledge comes alive. When you're doing hand reading, a certain amount of it is kind of formalized, like the drawing up of an astrological chart.
Mm.
But then there's a point where you can describe one feature, and then it connects with that person. They respond, and suddenly you see their response reflected in other aspects of the hand.
Mm.
And there's a point then when you just discard the print and you're just intuitively going with the flow of the reading. And I found generally the more readings that I've done in that category, the better they are. They're usually the ones that are most illuminating for that moment, what they most needed to hear at that particular time. So yes.
If I could just make a quick comparison, because I'd like to hear your take on this. So basically, in the Indian hand reading, there's kind of three categories that they'll look at. So the first thing is elementally to do with it. I mean, obviously, Ayurveda's using, they have three doshas, but 5 elements, and you're probably working more with 4. But they'll kind of look elementally at the hand, the shape and the compactness and the strength. Then the next thing that would be of interest would be the actual lines themselves. You know, which line is prominent, which is broken, which is running into what, you know, so it's more to do with the lines, how they connect. And then the sort of third level they look at is what they call the symbolic level, where they're then looking for sort of symbolism in the hand. It's not so much about the lines, it's the shapes that they make. So they're looking for, you know, trikona, like triangles, squares, conch shells, plows, or moon shapes, umbrellas, you know, that it's more symbolistic interpretation on the hand. So there's those 3 things that are going on concurrently. And of course, you've got 2 hands as well. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about that. But, you know, when you're actually looking, you know, so somebody comes into your room and says, okay, I want a hand, I'd like a hand analysis, and they're putting their hands down. Are you, you know, you're looking at one hand more? Would you look at the left hand or the right hand first? You look at both, you just get a general feel. You know, are you approaching it in the same kind of way? Are you breaking it down into different things that you're looking at, or is it just a general across the board?
There's a sort of a hierarchical order, the way I approach the hand. You're building up a picture of a person, and I start off with the complete hand, the overall shape of the hand, and that picture essentially defines the person. So the shape of the hand, I give the analogy, it's like the vehicle that you're born into. So part of the shape of the hand, we look at the relationship of the fingers to the palm. Then we consider the quality of the skin texture and classify that as well. And we divide the hand into 4, or the palm into 4 sections of the quadrants. So that's the vehicle that you're born into. Then you look at the lines on the hand, and that connects with the consciousness of the individual. So you can think of the lines generally as being like the driver as they're going through life. And then with the fingers, that's like the area of the psychological makeup. That's the knowledge that they are able to draw from as they're steering their vehicle through life.
Right.
And so you're putting all those things together. With the right and left hand, I basically ask the person whether they're right or left-handed. And obviously, if they're right-handed, you'll consciously direct more energy into that hand. And so its forms, its structure, formation of the lines reflects that person more in the present. And the converse is true with the passive hand. So if it was the left hand, then the patterns that are innate to it reflect more of the past. So by putting, matching information from the active hand to corresponding features in the passive hand, you can work out how a person has drawn from the qualities of the past, whether they're fully expressing them and refining them, or whether they're kind of completely ignorant of their latent potential that's kind of they're born with, or whether they've had enormous abilities and made a complete and utter mess of them. all that is, possible in the human realms, I suppose, what we do with our lives. So I think, yeah, that's all part of the joy of reading hands.
And how much in terms of, because obviously you're doing astrology as well, so are you drawing up a chart and then looking for corresponding signs in the hand, or do you treat them two as two quite separate entities?
I find that it's fascinating when you do a hand in relation to a person's chart. I've also found that loads of people will come to have a hand reading who previously already had an astrologer consult their natal chart. So automatically it becomes part of the conversation of doing the reading for people. Personally, I find when you've got a hand print and all the information, you've got astrological chart, it's overawing with the potential range of knowledge there. And when people come to you for a particular problem, they have a very narrow focus on what can I do? How can I get rid of this problem? I need help here. And the bulk of this umbrella of knowledge you can potentially offer is academic if you don't actually focus in on enabling them to understand their problem so they can resolve it and move on. So in practicality's sake, I do very few readings with a hand print and also an astrological chart. Occasionally I will get people who just want to know more about themselves, and so you've got a different framework. So you can indulge then in a more lengthy, more philosophical perspective of a person's life.
It's a big thing to bite off. I don't think I'd really want to start looking at somebody's chart and the hand at the same time. I find it's like one is enough, really. And there's often enough interest in it. Like I say, that using the Vedic approach, there's those three levels. So you could see a symbol and you might want to talk about that symbol. They see them as boons. You've been granted some special dispensation or outstanding merit from a previous life, and this is your chance to use that, or for that quality in you to blossom in this life. That could be one approach. Or then in terms of lines, if a line's very strong and it's pointing to a particular planet, so let's say there was some good Martian quality about the person, quite often this kind of little Martian triangle on the side of the thumb, if that's overpronounced, the person becomes a bit argumentative and a bit inclined towards accidents or something. But conversely, they also become good statisticians and strategic planners, and they could philanthropic as well. There's all these other qualities. So sometimes if you see an outstanding planet in the palm, that can point you in this person is being kind of ruled by that. So they even look a little bit Martian. Maybe they're a bit sort of hot, and a bit inclined towards injury or febrile or that kind of, so those kind of connections are usually enough. And like you say, in a consultation of what, 1 hour, I mean, how much can you cover? So sometimes it's just better, like you say, to focus on and give the most needed piece of advice at that time, which is obviously what you're doing. But having done that, then people well, I think you already said earlier that people are coming for, if it's psychological, they're coming for that. If they're coming for herbal, they're coming for that. But are you sort of thinking when people come, well, I've seen that, perhaps that could be supported with herbs? And then how would you pick those herbs? Would you do it in accordance with planets or elements, or how would you work health-wise with the person?
Well, with planets primarily, and then each herb has got sort of hot qualities of hot, cold, wet and dry. But what I wanted to do is to come back to one of the key features of hand reading, which has most inspired me over the years, is what I mentioned earlier about my first meditation teacher saying about when people do their spiritual practices, the lines change. And I've always taken the view that when you see negative features, events, circumstances in the hand, rather than just bomb them with, 32, you can have a car accident or whatever. You can explain it in terms of why they're going through that experience. And that gives them the power to do something about it, to overcome it. And when people consciously then realign their life, then the lines will alter. Now, in my hand reading book, The Hand Reveals, I've got a study there of one of the monks at the ashram where I first received instruction in Denmark, who arrived there as a complete junkie. Swamiji took under his wing people who kind of were addicted to LSD and other drugs, and started to give them a kind of purpose, a direction in their life. And this guy was rock bottom. And he then adopted the yoga. He did the meditation, the pranayama exercises. He did hard physical work on the farm in support of the ashram. And someone at the time took his handprint when he first arrived. And then when I came along and started taking handprints of people there, I got this wonderful 6-year period where this guy had undergone all this rigorous sadhana and discipline, and the lines have been completely rewritten. And so in the book, there's a sort of section on change in the hand. Now, I've always kind of worked with handprints of people when they come to me. And one of the key reasons for that is you've got a record of where the person was at that time of the reading, because they may well then come back to you 6 months, years, decades later even. And you can take another imprint of their hand and you can compare features. And everyone's lines change. They don't actually have to do yoga. But circumstantially, as we go through various experiences, for better or for worse, then the lines will grow, alter, other lines disappear. In times of stress, of illness, more lines can emerge. And taking a chronological progression of handprints over a sort of year or 2-year intervals, you get this picture, this perspective of consciousness of that person changing in time through the course of their life. And I've always found that to be the most compelling, absorbing aspect of reading hands.
Interesting. And how about like the working with the mounds and stuff like that? I mean, how do you see those? I know some hand readers kind of, the sort of in recent times more sort of shying away from them. But I mean, are you working with those a lot? Are you sort of looking along the plane of the hand and just seeing what mound is kind of outstanding, or is it more the lines, the sort of primary lines, or
mounds? I think have been massively overemphasized in the palmistic tradition. And the reason being that people are kind of indulged in hand reading palmistry as a sort of parlor game, were generally people who didn't do very much in their life. And as a result, their hands are quite sort of podgy. I mean, when you see mounts, they literally stand out about a centimetre above the surface of the hand. For most people now, so many people have to do work. A lot of people do sort of manual work.
Yeah.
Mounts are no longer that pronounced. Obviously, the two main ones, the lunar mount here and the Venus mount here, they're pretty commonly emphasized in people's hands. But I use the analogy of mounts, a bit like mountains. The mountains are where the rivers start their flow,
Yeah.
and the geology of the mountain um, influences the nature of the flow of the river. So if you've got a river that, say, starts with a spring in a chalk stream area, it's clear, sparkling, effervescent. Whereas if you've got something that emerges from a peat moor on top of a mountain, you know, you get to the sort of waterfalls and it looks like a beer, you know, the sort of foam and the colour of the beer. But, you know, a lot of the Scottish waterfalls do look like that, like beer just flowing over these rocks. You've got different planetary energies in the mounts of the hand, and the lines then in flowing from or connecting to or having influence lines coming in shows that sort of energy incorporated into the general flow of the energy through the line.
Are you still working with the sort of primary four, like the sort of heart line, life, fate, or
Whatever's visible, you
just
know.
whatever's?
That's one of the features I find fascinating, is it is like a continuous printout of that person's consciousness, and whole lines might be absent, and correspondingly that area of that person's consciousness is not present, not functioning, and they have no understanding of it. So you kind of read the lines as is. I find out the person's date of birth and therefore their age, and I plot then along the course of a line where they're kind of currently at, and then see what features in the lines are lit up at that moment in time. And that usually concords with what that person is going through, what they've come to see you about. Yeah.
Do you find that the like the fate line is a particularly difficult one to read these days? I find that that's the kind of line that always throws me a little bit, because they seem to be either incredibly short,
Yeah,
lost in the mash of everything else. I mean, why has that become? Some people, it's very clear, isn't it? You've got like this straight line that runs straight up the middle, and there's no kind of mystery. But others seem to get lost or diverted, or I just see that a lot. That's probably the most
that's
common
right.
thing.
Well, I think that taking that line as an example, it's very much to do with your path, your career in life. And where that line is fully present, then people often know at a very early age in their life what they're going to be doing in their life, and will, you know, study accordingly, go off to a particular institution to train them, and then, you know, religiously stick to that direction and have a career and gain recognition and eminence in their field. That is rare. Very few people vocationally have that certitude of their calling. And in this day and age, you know, careers can be over in a snap. You know, in the
That's
gig
right.
economy, you just have to be at beck and call on the end of a telephone. So that is no certitude. That's no kind of security at all.
We could go and just talk a little bit more about your book. Obviously, your book's, I think it's in the fourth edition now. It's just going to be, or has it been re-released, or is it? It's been
Oh
re-released,
yes,
hasn't it?
it's
Yeah,
been out a couple of years now.
yeah.
But basically, it's a book I wrote in the 90s, and it is essentially a textbook that takes people through every aspect of the hand, from the hand shapes, the skin texture, the palmar quadrants, going through all the lines, how you interpret the lines, going through the fingers, the phalanges, the thumb, and then synthesize it all together. And it's set out in a very structured way. I explain all the symbolism that you need to make the necessary connections. I'll show you how to take a handprint. But I've written it in a way that engages you. It's not a dry textbook. I mean, I've had many people now say to me, it's incredible. I started it knowing it was a textbook, but I found I was absorbed into it as though I was reading a novel.
I've seen an earlier edition of it, but so in this more recent up to date one, you've expanded a little bit as well. There's a slight, you've kind of expanded the text.
Yeah, I was sort of limited by a deadline in my first contract for the book. So I didn't manage to do the bit on planetary handshapes successfully. And actually, after I literally handed over the manuscript, I came across a French palmist by the name of Georges Mouchery, who did some really sterling work on planetary handshapes, albeit written in French. But I spent a bit of time translating it. And as I translated it, it sparked off new ideas for me. And that's basically that chapter.
That's included in the new, yeah. So how do people go about contacting you if they're interested in knowing more, if they wanted to come and study with them? And do you do one-to-one classes, or is there any kind of online teaching? How would people find out more?
I mean, for Aeon Books, I did a course called An Introduction to Cheiromancy, or the Art of Cheiromancy. And that's on the Aeon Education, give you a link to that. And no, I've taught it for decades. So I've put everything into this video, and you can now download it, so sign up to it, and I'll take you through everything about the hand, and it's done in parallel with the Hand Reveals book.
Okay.
So the book is essentially a textbook of my teaching.
Is it is it an audio over the top of slides, or is it you actually teaching, so you're on the screen talking about stuff, or are you kind of showing slides all the way through it? So there's lots of graphic information.
I'm on a little picture in the corner.
An inset box, yeah, okay.
An inset box of my mug, basically, teaching.
Brilliant.
There are moments when it goes to full screen of a particular illustration from the book. But yeah.
And like email or something like that, how would people can they contact you directly, or?
Yeah, by email. I'll give you, well, you've got my email address.
I'll pop that up as well.
Yeah, I'm more now to do with writing about material, getting my experiences down, and hoping people then subscribe to my webinars and things instead.
I think on that note, we'll wrap up and just say thank you very much, Dylan. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate talking, that you took the time to talk to us, and it's been fascinating. So hopefully people...
It's my pleasure.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.